When communism died, Putin and Xi both reached for the same dangerous weapon, militant nationalism. It's the last refuge of failed empires, and watching them both deploy it simultaneously should terrify anyone who understands how this story ends. Nationalism is intoxicating in the short term, but it's ultimately destructive, and both leaders are discovering they can't control the forces they've unleashed. When everything else fails, when economic systems collapse, when religious authority crumbles, when rational governance becomes impossible, authoritarian leaders always reach for the same toxic solution. They wrap themselves in the flag and blame everything on foreigners. What keeps me awake at night is watching both Russia and China make this desperate choice at exactly the same moment in history, because nationalist fervor makes rational de-escalation nearly impossible and greatly increases the chances of catastrophic miscalculation. Both Putin and Xi have backed themselves into corners where their political survival depends on projecting strength against external enemies, regardless of the cost to their own societies or global stability. Let me explain how we got here and why it's so dangerous. For Putin, the path to nationalist desperation began with the collapse of every other source of legitimacy that Russian leaders had relied on for centuries. Under the Tsars, Russian expansion was justified by the ideology of the Third Rome, Moscow as the heir to Byzantine Christianity and the protector of Orthodox believers everywhere. This gave Russian imperialism a religious mission that could inspire genuine loyalty among believers and provide moral justification for conquering Orthodox populations in the Balkans and elsewhere. When the communists seized power, they replaced religious justification with ideological mission. Russia was no longer spreading orthodoxy, but rather leading the global proletarian revolution against capitalist exploitation. This gave Soviet expansion a secular moral purpose that could attract supporters worldwide and justify intervention anywhere class struggle was occurring. But today, Putin has nothing comparable to offer. Russian Orthodoxy appeals only to Russians and a few fellow Orthodox populations, making it useless for global influence. Communism is thoroughly discredited both economically and morally after decades of failure and mass killing. What's left is just raw territorial extent and the promise that Russians deserve to dominate others because they're Russians. That's not ideology, that's just ethnic chauvinism dressed up with historical grievances. She faces an even more profound crisis of legitimacy because Chinese civilization had been built on more sophisticated foundations than Russian imperialism. For over 2 millennia, Chinese governance was based on Confucian principles that provided a complete worldview and system of ethics. The mandate of heaven required rulers to govern virtuously for the benefit of their subjects. Economic prosperity demonstrated that the dynasty retained divine favor, and territorial integrity proved that civilization could defend itself against barbarian invasions. This system survived dynasty after dynasty because it provided genuine legitimacy based on performance rather than just ethnic identity or military conquest. But every pillar of traditional Chinese legitimacy has collapsed under Communist Party rule. Ethical governance, the party's record of corruption, arbitrary rule, and mass killing makes any claim to moral authority laughable. Economic prosperity, China's growth is slowing dramatically, and the benefits have been concentrated among party elites, while ordinary people face declining opportunities and increasing surveillance. Territorial integrity, the party controls the mainland but has failed to unify Taiwan, and growing tensions with neighbors suggest that military confrontation may be necessary to maintain even current territorial claims. This left the Communist Party with the same desperate choice that Putin faced: turn to ethnic nationalism as the only remaining source of popular support. The turning point for China came after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, when it became clear that communist ideology could no longer motivate the Chinese population. The party made a calculated decision to rewrite all the textbooks and shift the focus from class enemies to ethnic enemies. No more emphasis on capitalists oppressing workers. Now it was all about evil Japanese who had invaded China, evil Americans who were trying to contain China's rise, and evil anyone else who questioned Chinese territorial claims or challenged party authority. This wasn't subtle propaganda adjustment. It was a complete reimagining of Chinese identity around Han ethnic supremacy and historical grievances against foreign powers. The party systematically cultivated resentment against Japan for World War II atrocities, against the United States for Cold War containment policies, and against any neighbor who dared to resist Chinese territorial expansion. They turned historical suffering into a weapon for modern politics, using past humiliations to justify present aggression and future expansion. What makes this particularly dangerous is how nationalism changes the decision-making calculus for both leaders. Rational policy analysis becomes impossible when your legitimacy depends on never appearing weak or backing down from confrontations with foreign enemies. Every international disagreement becomes a test of national honor that cannot be resolved through normal diplomatic compromise. Every territorial dispute becomes an existential struggle that must be won regardless of cost. Most dangerously, nationalism creates expectations among the population that reality simply cannot meet over the long term. Putin has promised Russians that they will restore their historical greatness and dominate their neighbors just as the Soviet Union once did. But Russia lacks the economic, technological, and demographic resources to sustain this kind of imperial project in the modern world. Xi has promised Chinese people that they will achieve the great rejuvenation of Chinese civilization and restore China's historical position as the center of the world order. But China faces serious economic headwinds, demographic collapse, and growing international resistance to its expansion. What happens when these grandiose promises meet harsh reality? Nationalist leaders can't admit failure because that would undermine the entire basis of their authority. They can't scale back their ambitions because their supporters expect continued victories against foreign enemies. Their only option is to escalate confrontations in hopes that bigger gambles will produce the spectacular victories they need to maintain credibility. This is how nationalist movements typically end, not with rational reassessment and strategic adjustment, but with increasingly desperate gambles that eventually produce catastrophic failures. The most insidious aspect of nationalism is how it makes rational calculation impossible not just for leaders but for entire societies. When people are told repeatedly that their civilization is superior and their enemies are evil, they begin to believe that victory is inevitable and that any setbacks are temporary. This makes it very difficult for leaders to prepare their populations for the sacrifices that prolonged confrontations require. And it makes it nearly impossible to build public support for the kind of strategic patience that might actually serve national interests. Putin has discovered this problem in Ukraine, where his promises of quick victory and minimal cost have proven completely false. Russian society was prepared for a short, successful military operation that would restore Russian prestige at low cost. They were not prepared for a grinding war of attrition that has devastated the Russian military and economy while failing to achieve any of its stated objectives. But Putin cannot admit this failure without undermining his entire nationalist project, so he continues to escalate in hopes that bigger commitments will somehow produce better results. Xi is likely to face the same dilemma if China moves against Taiwan. Chinese nationalism has created expectations that Taiwan will be reunified quickly and at minimal cost, with American and Allied resistance proving ineffective against Chinese determination and superior civilization. But actual military conflict would likely prove far more difficult and costly than Chinese propaganda has suggested, creating the same dynamic that has trapped Putin in Ukraine. Once nationalist leaders commit to major confrontations, they cannot afford to lose, but they also cannot afford to fight indefinitely. This gives their opponents enormous leverage because they know that nationalist regimes are trapped in unsustainable positions that will eventually force them to choose between catastrophic escalation and humiliating defeat. The tragedy is that this nationalist spiral was probably avoidable if either leader had chosen genuine reform and modernization instead of scapegoating foreigners for domestic failures. Russia has vast natural resources, a highly educated population, and rich cultural traditions that could form the basis for prosperous development if properly managed. China has enormous human capital, entrepreneurial energy, and technological capabilities that could continue driving growth and innovation if not distorted by authoritarian control and imperial ambitions. but both leaders chose nationalist confrontation instead of constructive engagement. They preferred to blame external enemies rather than address internal problems, choosing zero sum competition over mutually beneficial cooperation. Now they're trapped in nationalist logic that makes rational policy adjustment nearly impossible. The question for the rest of us is how to manage these nationalist movements without either appeasing their demands or provoking catastrophic escalation. History suggests this won't be easy, but understanding the dynamics that drive nationalist escalation is essential for navigating the dangerous period ahead.